The Unshackled Waves, episode 187.
Broadcasting from Melbourne, Australia, this is The Unshackled Waves with Tim Wills, brought to you by theunshackled.net.
Hello everyone, great to have your company. Federal Parliament returned this week with Scott Morrison still unable to explain how he's Prime Minister and how he's different from Malcolm Turnbull. The mainstream media in the United States again think that they have President Donald Trump on the ropes after the New York Times published an anonymous op-ed piece from an alleged Trump administration official calling themselves part of the resistance. Plus, veteran journalist Bob Woodward is releasing a book on the Trump administration. Today is 9/11, which not only means it's the anniversary of the 2001 US Islamic terror attacks, but also the 1973 coup in Chile, which saw Augusto Pinochet rise to power. Also, Sweden, the world's biggest multicultural failure, saw the current centre-left government not obtaining a majority and the nationalist Swedish Democrats holding the balance of power. To discuss all these developments, I welcome back to the show for the first time in a while, Senior Editor of the Unshackled Damien Ferri. Damien, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me, Tim.
Now, it's been a while since we've had you on, but since you're the senior editor, I thought we'd discuss developments not just in Australia, but around the world, since there's been a lot happening. But we'll start in Australia, which the major political story is still the change in Prime Minister from Malcolm Turnbull to Scott Morrison. Last week, he gave Scott Morrison his first major speech, which it was pretty much like his first speech after becoming Prime Minister, where he talked about how we're on your side and said a whole bunch of motherhood statements. This time in his speech last week, he said he wanted all Australians to love each other. It was all lovey-dovey stuff. It was vague, and there was no new policies announced at all. It was just more of the same.
That's right. It just seemed like he lacked direction. He didn't really state exactly what kind of path that he wanted to take the country in. He didn't highlight any differences to the previous Prime Minister, and he just said a lot of rhetoric, which was, like you said, a lot of lovey-dovey diversity. A lot of stuff that you'd hear usually from the left, and he was. He just seemed to really offer us nothing new. And the whole purpose of him coming to the table and actually becoming Prime Minister was because Turnbull was failing as a Prime Minister. So he had to offer something different. And he hasn't yet proved that he is that man that is going to lead to that change. I mean, Dutton had a point. He could have argued that he was a different guy, and he already came out and highlighted differences and ways and things he would pursue. But Morrison hasn't really done that. And I mean, like me and you have discussed earlier, the problem with this government is that the two reasons that they failed is because the company tax cuts and also the NEG, the two policies that were very unpopular with the electorate, weren't doing well, and they decided that they needed a different leadership team. The problem is that they selected the leadership team that were the head honchos behind those two policies. So the problem is that really, if they were highlighting the fact that they were on the wrong path in regards to policy, why is it that they chose the two people that were in charge of that to now lead the government?
Well, that's Scott Morrison's biggest challenge, is that he can't explain why he's Prime Minister now and why he has replaced Malcolm Turnbull, given that he was not the person who was agitating for the leadership change. I mean, he was the treasurer, Malcolm Turnbull's right-hand man, and there was the famous man hug that the two did on the week of the leadership spill. Peter Dutton was the challenger. He was the one who stood against Malcolm Turnbull at the Tuesday spill, and then stood again during the Friday spill, and he spelled out an alternative vision. And when it was clear that the petition to have the second party room meeting was going to get up, that's when Malcolm Turnbull, when he lost the second spill motion, that's when he resigned. And the strategy was from Malcolm Turnbull was to the reason why he asked for the 43 signatures was to buy Scott Morrison time, who was his preferred successor. So he managed to thwart his challenger, Peter Dutton, who would have spelled out an alternative manifesto. And instead, we've got Scott Morrison, who's the accidental Prime Minister. Yes, his hands are clean. He's got no blood on his hands. But since he's Turnbull's preferred candidate, he can't really change that much, because he was the treasurer. He's got Malcolm Turnbull's blessing. And so when he's asking question time, why are you Prime Minister and not Malcolm Turnbull, he can't really answer it. All he says is, well, ask the people who instigated this leadership change. It's their job to explain.
That's right. I mean, he doesn't really have an answer for it. I mean, that's the funny thing about this. He hasn't got an answer as to why he's in the top job. I mean, Dutton would have had an answer. I mean, because he offered a different direction for that government. And that's why he was challenging in the first place. I mean, well, to put it straightforward, I mean, Turnbull was the one who spilled the leadership in the first place. And it just happened to be that Dutton thought, well, this is an opportunity now to highlight a bit of no confidence in the Prime Minister. And he managed to get a really massive vote, which then ended up in the couple of days that we had of turmoil. But the thing is, I mean, Morrison doesn't offer anything different to the previous government. The policies are going to be the same. Fair enough, he's going to say now that the neg is going to be dead, but he's not come out and said anything about the Paris climate change agreement there. So, I mean, that's something that he needs to prove now, that on that issue of energy, that he's not going to take this, leftist kind of approach to this feel-good approach, and he's going to actually stand by and not allow us to waste so much money when it isn't necessary at all, and it just doesn't do anything for the environment. I mean, he has to show leadership on this issue and show a clear difference as to how he is different to the previous government. And that's going to be something that he's going to find very difficult. I mean, he might not have blood on his hands, but he doesn't have a reason to be there. Whereas the people that may have had blood on their hands actually could have said in Parliament that this is why I'm here, because of these reasons, because of immigration and because of, energy and all those issues that Dutton had mentioned. But he really doesn't offer any change.
Yeah, and it's a bit like when the Labor leadership went from Kevin Rudd to Julia Gillard. The explanation given was that a good government lost its way, and the public who wanted to know how come we went to sleep with one Prime Minister and woken up with another. We know that the public do not like these leadership changes, and they're asking for an explanation, and Scott Morrison's not giving one. Like, at least with the change from Tony Abbott to Malcolm Turnbull laid out why he believed Tony Abbott had failed. It was the economic narrative, and there was a change when Turnbull became Prime Minister. I mean, Abbott was running very heavily on national security at the time, and Turnbull came in and he wanted to have a positive vision where he talked about it's never been a more exciting time to be alive, innovative and agile. They were his favorite words. There was a lot of people, a lot of conservatives didn't like it, but you could tell that there was a difference between Tony Abbott and Malcolm Turnbull, where there's not between Malcolm Turnbull and Scott Morrison. I mean, Scott Morrison's called his own ascension to the Prime Ministership a Muppet show, and so the public are like, well, if that's what you think of it, then how the hell, why should we accept this?
That's true. I mean, and there also was a clear, decisive change when Abbott took over Turnbull's position as leader in 2009. I mean, that was another time when there was a clear difference. But if you want to go back in time when Turnbull knifed Nelson, he didn't really offer much of a reasoning behind it either, just basically an egotistical sort of reason of, I'm more popular with the electorate kind of thing, rather than giving a reason as to why Nelson shouldn't have been there. And that's where it all started for the Liberal Party. I mean, Turnbull was the first one to start this, and now he has nerve to whinge about him getting ousted. And I mean, it is a Muppet show, but at the end of the day, it all started with him. He is the one that made a copyright version of the Labor Party. The Labor Party was going through this, and he decided to follow suit and to also go in this direction of tearing down leaders, especially when he removed Tony Abbott as Prime Minister. That was the real nail in the coffin there, because it wasn't just as an opposition leader getting changed, which was quite common, but when you tear down a Prime Minister in the first term, that's where it all really made the Liberals no different to Labor on this issue. So, I mean, it doesn't make a lot of sense. And, I mean, there's a lot of personality at play here. And I think we need to really show these people that we are sick of it as you know, as voters, as people in the electorate, that we deserve better, and they have to get the message that they have to start representing us, rather than trying to, be social climbers up the ladder and trying to focus on their own jobs rather than trying to do good for us.
Yeah, there's been no real policy change. Basically, we've been told that the neg is now dead, but we don't know what will replace it. But of course, as we've discussed, Morrison and Frydenberg, who's the new Deputy Liberal leader and Treasurer, he was, as Energy Minister, designed the National Energy Guarantee and said that he's sad to see it go. And so you basically got a leadership team who is tied to the previous policy, expressing sadness that the policy is dead, but they're the leaders who have to come up with a new one, even though they preferred the old one.
That's exactly, yeah, true. I mean, it's madness, really. I mean, there's people there that are trying to look like they're going for a different approach, and it's an approach they don't believe in themselves. I mean, we can't believe in what they're trying to do if they don't believe in it themselves. I mean, these two, the Frydenberg and Morrison team here, are trying to please everybody. They're trying to represent conservatives, trying to represent moderates, and at the end of the day, it's going to backfire against them, because the conservatives don't see them as conservative and see them as wets, and the moderates see them as more on the conservative side of things, and that they got that the party shifted to the right because of Turnbull going. So, I mean, either way, them claiming themselves to be of the centre of the party and trying to unify the party, I don't think is going to work. I mean, if we had a leader in there that was going to make changes, I mean, you could love him or hate him, but at the end of the day, you knew where he stood, and you knew that he was actually trying to push a different direction. And this team here aren't doing that. I mean, the immigration issue is something they don't want to address, and that's something that's really a hot topic, and that's been a hot topic for a long time. And they don't want to do anything about immigration numbers, for instance, whereas Dutton would have been someone that wanted to push that issue and reduce numbers. We know that was something that he had planned. He had a very different approach on energy than they did. And, I mean, if you are going into a team and you're not believing in what you are standing for, and you are also fake, which is what it's coming across, that they're just trying to be everybody's mates without taking a real stance. I mean, they're already looking at losing the next election because of this Muppet show that you were saying before. It's going to be very hard for them, even to beat someone as hopeless as Bill Shorten. I mean, you know, someone that you would never think would become Prime Minister, but has a good chance because of how bad the Liberal Party is.
And Morrison, he started his political career as a conservative. He was described as a young up-and-coming conservative when Tony Abbott first promoted him to immigration minister. But obviously he's been tied to, assisted Malcolm Turnbull to become Prime Minister and was his treasurer for 3 years. He's tried to unleash his inner conservative since he became Prime Minister. He's talked about how he wants to protect religious freedom in the aftermath of same-sex marriage, given that it was sort of put on the back burner by Malcolm Turnbull. And he also spoke out against gender whisperers in schools who teachers are now told that they've got to identify children with gender dysphoria and refer them to gender clinics.
I think Morrison was tapping into a large segment of the community that have a real issue with this political correctness and the safe schools approach that's happening here, but a lot of people are just too scared to speak out about it. I think, it was great to see him tweet something like that. I mean, something that you wouldn't think was a big deal, but obviously the mainstream media made it one. But he needs to do more. He needs to really make a stance because, I mean, this is going to win him support. I mean, if he takes a real stance on issues such as the Safe Schools program and religious freedom especially, considering that SSM has passed about a year ago or close to a year ago now, I mean, and we still haven't had religious freedom laws by Philip Ruddock that was supposed to be the person organising this, still hasn't gone in. And you would have thought that it's madness to put SSM in so quickly as they did without actually having any laws to protect religious freedom. I mean, they pushed it to the following year. It was supposed to be early this year that they were going to do something about it, and they did nothing about it yet. And I mean, this is an issue that needs to be really discussed, because if they continue to not do anything about it and Labor come 6 months' time or so win the next election, you can guarantee that Labor's not going to do anything about it, and you're going to have a situation where we're not going to have any freedom when it comes to religious conviction in this country.
Well, let's turn to the United States now, where the mainstream media believe that they've got President Trump on the ropes, because there was a New York Times op-ed allegedly published by a person inside the Trump administration talking, which was titled "I am part of the resistance inside the Trump administration," and they're claiming that they're protecting the nation against Trump making bad decisions, and that they're doing the best to thwart him. And this is at the same time as Bob Woodward, who's the journalist who was made famous during by breaking the Watergate scandal, has got a new book out, Fear Trump in the White House, which talks to a lot of insiders, which they claim that Trump is stupid and Asian officials manipulate him to get the policy outcomes that he wants. They've tried this tactic for so long. The mainstream media say, "Oh, we've got a moron in the White House, and he has to basically be molded into making the right decisions," which is it's just so ridiculous.
Yeah, this is what they do. I mean, the mainstream media have such an influence on politicians and politics at large that, I mean, what they do, and we see it here, especially in Australia as well, that they will continue to destroy someone's image, someone's credibility, just so they can have one of their own guys in. They want a press gallery type, an intellectual sort of progressive type person, whether on the right or the left, doesn't really matter. Because, I mean, at the end of the day, for instance here, someone like Turnbull, even in America, someone like Romney. I mean, someone like Romney was really someone that, a lot of people that would be described as of the left would love to have in the White House. I mean, he is the Turnbull equivalent in the US, someone of an intellectual upper class background, progressive on the social issues. This is what they want, somebody like that. I mean, economics really to them isn't a big issue, and that's the only kind of distinction between, I guess, Democrats and Republicans. But on the social front, they want the parties to be the same when it comes to the progressive issues they push. Now, in regards to the article, what I find very odd is that this person doesn't actually put their name to it. And, I mean, we don't really have any proof of this coming from the administration at all. And, I mean, anyone could have written it. And I think it's quite amazing that they would have published something like that and not had a name put on it. I mean, it's very odd. I mean, normally you would have a journalist that might write an article and state that there might be unrest within the Trump administration, that there might be issues, and they might have heard whispers, for instance. But for someone to write an article and not even have their name on the article at all, that to me is just a little bit out of the ordinary. I just don't understand how that could be published and received at all. It just seems really odd.
Yeah, and it's very vague also, this article, if you've read it. I mean, it doesn't go into specifics. It's just, I'm inside the Trump administration and I'm, secretly working, to keep this nation safe against this evil man. I mean, and of course, the New York Times is just like the rest of the mainstream media, and so they also, there's this, massive conspiracy in the administration to make sure we're protected from Trump. And now it's started this ridiculous conversation, or will the 25th Amendment be enacted to remove Trump from office, which is, and this is the mainstream media trying to basically make this op-ed as big as possible. And I remember when the Michael Wolff book was released, Fire and Fury, inside the Trump White House at the beginning of the year, which made similar accusations against President Trump. That was supposed to bring down his presidency. The Mika Korinsky bleeding facelift tweet, that was supposed to bring down Trump's presidency. They're always predicting the end, the mainstream media, that Trump, he's gone too far. This time the evidence is damning against him. Yet look at the figures. I mean, Trump's public approval ratings are higher than Obama's were at the same time of his presidency. His approval among Republicans is close to 80%, and if you look at the U.S. economy, it's growing strong with more jobs. I mean, all the indicators are positive for the US and for Trump, yet the mainstream media, they're just looking for, this is going to be this is it. He's proven he's unhinged. He's finished now.
Will Trump ever recover? I mean, that kind of reminds me of the classic meme that you always hear within our circles, just bagging the establishment out when they always try and come out with reasons to predict his downfall. But he's still there, So, I mean, I think, like you said, he's polling very highly. He's doing a top job, and the electorate love what he's doing. I mean, he's pandering to both elements of across the board. I mean, he's very strong on national security. So a lot of people in the right. You traditional Republicans are loving that, and also your more populist sort of leaning people. So I guess you could say your Reagan Democrats are really favouring what Trump has been doing when it comes to the Rust Belt states. And I mean, he's really been able to, like Reagan, establish himself as not really someone that is purely a left or right politician, but someone that just tries to take an agenda and do what he feels is right for the nation, whether you agree or disagree with that approach. I mean, you can't really say that he doesn't actually put himself out there and do things that are unpopular, and he doesn't really care about his image. Like, I mean, he's willing to be criticised and put down because he's doing in his mind the right thing. And I think that's something that really on any side of politics we have to admire. I mean, you know, I guess we have the similar sort of politicians down in Australia, like, for instance, your Bob Katter, Fraser Anning types. They get a lot of respect even from people, you know, on the right or the left, just because they can admire, whether they agree or disagree with these people. They can admire the fact that they stand for something and that they fight hard for it, and they have positions. Because a lot of people, career politicians, they aren't there because they want to make a change for the better. They're just there for their own jobs. And I mean, we know that Trump doesn't have to be there because he's got a lot of money, he's wealthy, he doesn't have to be doing that job. So by doing so, he's just really putting himself out and making his life more difficult by undertaking that role. But ultimately, like I said, I mean, it's unbelievable that such an article, for instance, will be published. I mean, I know that there was a bit of rumour that it could have been Mike Pence, but he came out and denounced it, and you know, he said that it wasn't the case. But there was rumour that it was him that published it. I mean, we don't even know if it was someone in the administration who published it at all. And that's why, to me, it's a very unethical thing for you know, the New York Times to be coming out with this material and not being able to have any proof at all. It's just such bad journalism on their behalf.
Now, at the time of recording this, the date is September 11th, which is the anniversary of the 2001 Islamic terror attacks in the United States. The Twin Towers fell down in New York City, and there was the Pentagon had a massive hole blown in it by planes that crashed into them, and it started what was called the War on Terror. And 17 years later, we were promised by the neocons that we go into Afghanistan and then later Iraq, that, you know, this was going to lead to the security of the West. But in the present day, I mean, Islam's influence has got worse, and we are less safe from terrorism than we've ever been.
Well, yeah, terrorism obviously is, you know, it's gotten worse over time. And like you said, the neocon strategy just doesn't work, because the more that you go in their countries and start bombing them and start attacking and trying to, you know, do something there, the more that you're going to have them hate you even worse, the more that they're going to then, well, the people that subscribe to that faith in your countries are obviously going to be radicalized based on that. I mean, it's counterproductive. It's such a stupid thing to do. I mean, you know, you can't take action. Say, for instance, a group of people that were behind such attacks caused, it was about 3,000 or so people to die. It was a terrible event. It was something that, you know, will be ingrained in memory forever, I'd say. It's just it was such a big thing that happened, that occurred, that changed history. But what they ended up doing was that they thought that the right thing, or the right approach to do, was to go into Afghanistan, then later on, then to go into Iraq, then trying to push into Syria, all the countries around the Middle East. And what are they trying to actually achieve here? I mean, obviously they have some sort of secret agendas that they aren't informing the public on. But I mean, at the end of the day, you know, I mean, if you want a situation to get worse, then you escalate it like they do. I mean, they've caused more people to be radicalized, more hatred, more violence. I mean, they're sacrificing soldiers over there for absolutely no reason. I mean, we have no business being in those countries. I mean, for all I care, if there's ruthless dictators that want to, you know, mistreat their citizens, that's their problem. It doesn't have anything to do with us. I mean, why should we go and sacrifice our people over there to try and change the way that they want to do things in their country? I mean, we wouldn't want that happening in our country, for them to come over and take over like For instance, we had in the Cold War communist countries trying to, slowly creep down, especially, the threats that we had on Australia from the Japs, for instance, is a good example. I mean, we don't want that happening here. We want to be able to govern the way we want to. So at the same time, they should be able to do what they want to do, and we don't need to get involved in that.
Now, September 11, it's also the anniversary of the 1973 Chilean coup, which saw military general Augusto Pinochet replace the president Salvador Allende. Now, Pinochet is viewed as a brutal dictator who abused human rights, but that is pretty much what you'd call fake history. Now, I'm sitting here in the studio with my Pinochet did nothing wrong shirt, and I've published a essay today talking about how Pinochet, he actually saved the nation, because Chile in 1973 under Salvador Allende, it's pointed out that, well, yes, he was democratically elected, but he only obtained 36% of the vote, so it wasn't like the majority of the country wanted him. It was a close three-way contest, and Chile by that time resembled, well, modern-day Venezuela. It had 1,000% inflation, it had food shortages, and Chile had 6-year terms, and so by 1973 he was Allende was only 3 years into his term, and so the Chamber of Deputies, they actually called on the military to depose Allende, and Pinochet, he wasn't an ideological person. He was a reluctant participant in the coup when it was basically only the last resort. That's when he chose, I really need to save Chile.
Yeah, well, I mean, when it comes to history, you can't believe everything you're told. I mean, we're told to think a certain way, and this is something that we grow up in through our classrooms. I mean, you really have to, if you want to be open-minded, we should be open-minded to every leader, every leader that's ever stood the test of time. I mean, if we want to get a proper opinion as to what we think they did and how they were as a person and what they achieved and what flaws they had, we need to do the research ourselves and to be able to decide for ourselves what we think is the right category and the right class to put this person in. And I mean, nobody's perfect, but it makes me laugh that, for instance, people like Pinochet, like you said, are always considered brutal dictators and fascist, Nazis, all the terms that you normally get. But at the same time, then it seems acceptable for people to wear Che Guevara shirts and to praise people like Castro, and I mean, we had that in our parliaments. I mean, we had members of the Labor and Green parties actually stand up when Castro had passed away and praise the guy for, being, somebody that looked after, the poor and, human rights and all the rest of it. And it just, it's unbelievable that people can say things like that and get away with it. No scrutiny at all. But if anybody was to, for instance, like you, come out and say, oh, look, Pinochet was a great leader and, he did great things, you'd be shut down straight away.
Yeah, I've been wearing this shirt proudly all day. I went down to the shops earlier tonight, and I had no qualms about wearing it. Nobody asked me about it. Probably most ignorant of history, and of course only get the standard politically correct history. But yeah, it's important that you raise that comparison between Pinochet and Castro. How the left they glamorize Castro. He's a romantic revolutionary. But if you compare the two, I mean, under Castro's regime, 100,000 people were killed. Under Pinochet's, I mean, there's heaps talked about the the torture and killings and disappearing, and of course the famous communists thrown out of helicopters by Pinochet. But the death toll from his regime is estimated to be 3,000, and most of that occurred between 1973 and 1975 because the country was in a state of civil war with the Marxist revolutionaries. A lot of them were terrorists. The military did what it had to do to basically make sure that the country was free of this Marxist socialist influence. And yes, there would have been innocent people who caught up with it. But let's have a look at Pinochet's legacy. He got... in 1975, Milton Friedman from the Chicago School to come over to Chile. He advised Pinochet to undertake free market reforms and undertook what was known as the Chilean miracle, where poverty in the country fell from 50% to 7% and per capita income quadrupled. And today, Chile is the richest country in Latin America, and it's also the most economically free one, which, if you have a look at the history of Latin American countries, I mean, there's socialist failures all over the place.
I mean, there's a lot of leaders that are continually shunned from the past, and that have done a great job, I mean, in relation to their country. Because, I mean, one thing that people have to understand, as good as democracy is, that if you, in a lot of cases, and we're seeing it here, have two parties on either end that literally exactly carbon copies of themselves, then you get to see that it's just a flaw, that they're basically two puppets on that are getting pulled on strings by one particular person, you know. Like, I mean, it's just amazing that, I mean, when you look at it that way, then it really isn't any different to a dictatorship when you're living in that sort of democracy. And I mean, in relation to the number, I mean, it is a big difference in numbers of deaths. Like you mentioned, I mean, there is the classic meme, of course, of communists not being people, so it doesn't count. But you know, like, I mean, it's you know, like, as you said, I mean, a couple thousand people and the situations given, I mean, is very different to 100,000 deaths from Castro, and also, like you said, you know, non-stop praise for the man, whereas, you know, someone like Pinochet is you know, definitely not given the same sort of admiration. And one thing that I actually want to point out in this is that it's very interesting that Pinochet, in a lot of ways, this is an ironic thing, I think, is that it showed that the one time that libertarianism in full force worked was under an authoritarian dictator, which is interesting, you know. Like, and a lot of libertarians noticed this, and, you know, that they genuinely like the man, apart from the Lolberts, but, you know, like, they see that, you know, it's not as clear as black and white when it comes to these. I mean, you know, someone that was able to use such a free market approach, and in the way that he did under a dictatorship rather than a democracy, yet it's been more ideologically what a libertarian, for instance, would want, rather than what we're currently living in the state of affairs as it is now. So, you know, you would definitely have something that you could add on that one.
Yeah, and it's worth pointing out as well that Pinochet did put the country on a path back to democracy. Obviously, he had to dissipate the communist threat during his early years, but he did hold a constitutional referendum in 1980, which was approved by 67%, which gave him an 8-year term as president, and there was no substantial allegations of vote rigging or voter intimidation. And then 8 years later, as promised, there was another vote on his presidency where 50 56% of the Chilean people said, no, we don't want Pinochet as our president anymore. And so he accepted that result and put in place a modified constitution. And in 1990, the first civilian head of government took office, and that's not a normal thing for dictatorships to happen. I mean, comparing with Castro, Castro ruled Cuba for 50 years as a dictator and handed power over to his brother in a monarchistic fashion. Meanwhile, Pinochet, he put the country back to democracy, actually gave up power when it was clear the people they wanted to move on. I mean, there's a big difference there.
Yeah, I think that highlights the difference, in particular with the communists versus the other authoritarian type leaders, because with communism, it's basically a totalitarian a state where one person demands such a power and basically puts everybody on the poverty line, as we know. And I mean, it is equality in a way, but all equally, you know, in a bad state, you know. I mean, whereas the other leaders, their reason in a lot of ways for being there, such as people like Pinochet, and that is he genuinely wanted to see the country get back on its feet, and he felt that he had to take that sort of approach in getting it there. Once it is in a good state, then he didn't really care for being there because the job was done. I mean, whether it was to revert back to democracy or not, he was happy, like you said, to take that decision or take the result when he did not continue on. And I mean, democracy can work so well, but the problem is that it can easily be corrupted, because if you have certain people in high positions controlling both teams on the left and the right, it gives the flawed vision to people that they have a choice. And a lot of times they don't. Whereas with people like Pinochet or other authoritarian leaders, they are what they are. Like, I mean, they're not lying about who they are. They're very straightforward. They've got clear, strong values in place as to what the kind of vision they have for their own country, whether you agree or disagree with them. Whereas a lot of the time, and you see it obviously these days, our politicians are all, you know, bought, you know, by either, you know, unions, by corporations, by all different people from all, you know, by banks. I mean, they're all, and a lot of them don't actually have deep embedded values like the people that they used to back in days like Pinochet, you know, and that's a clear difference there. I mean, if you're going to have democracy, make sure that people have clear choices and they're not voting for the same guy.
An election that's been watched closely over the past week is that which was happening in Sweden. Now, Sweden has a multi-party proportional representation system with the centre-left parties in a coalition together in government. Now, everyone's eye was on the nationalist Swedish Democrats, who have a anti-immigrant Swedish values platform, because if you've been following global events, you will know that Sweden, the supposedly feminist paradise, is being overrun by third world immigrants, which making all the feminist nightmares come true. It's titled the rape of Sweden. Now they obtained 17.6% of the party vote, won 63 out of 349 seats, and made it so that there was a hung parliament. The result was still not as high as people were hoping for the Swedish Democrats, but I think the Swedish people sent an important message.
Definitely. I mean, this is a start, and I think they'll only gain in future. I mean, this is one has to remember that Sweden is a very, very left-wing country. I mean, it's Scandinavia in general, Northern Europe is very, very progressive. So when you put that into the context, unlike, for instance, countries in the Mediterranean or in Eastern Europe, over in the north, they've got a very different set of values. They're very open-minded, very much modern in way of thinking. And for the Swedish Democrats, a party with nationalist views, to get 17.6% of the votes is a big achievement, considering, I mean, if they were in another country, for instance, you know, down in the south or the east, it might not have been a big result. But in somewhere like Sweden, it is a big result, because it isn't a country you'd expect would have such a result for a nationalist party. I mean, it's showing that the whole anti-EU, anti-immigrant sentiment is widespread over much of Europe. And why wouldn't it be? I mean, you know, people are clearly saying that they don't want to continue to have people from Africa, for instance, which is the most common immigrants that go there. I mean, just swamping their country. And I mean, it's just uncalled for. I mean, you know, like we said on the other debate there, you know, in a lot of cases are making these countries in a bad state when we're talking about, like, say, the Middle Eastern ones. Then these people then in turn become refugees. They go into the European countries and then make the European countries bad. And I mean, people are seeing what's going on and they don't want it.
Well, we've discussed some important themes and events tonight, Damien. It's been great to have you back on the show, and we hope that you can contribute more often.
Thanks, Tim. It was great to be here.
All right, everybody, that's the show for today. Nigel Farage's tour of Australia is wrapped up. You can see our highlights from his Melbourne show on our YouTube channel. Next up to Australia is internet television personality and founder of the Proud Boys, Gavin McGuinness, who we were lucky to have on the show last week, and he's pretty pumped to be coming to Australia and causing some mayhem here. He's being hosted by Penthouse Australia. You can book your place by going to gavinlive.com.au. Also, please consider becoming a patron of The Unshackled at patreon.com/TheUnshackled, as we can't continue to do all the work and cover all the stories that we do without your support. Or if, like many of you have been doing, please send us a direct contribution via our PayPal link, which is paypal.me/TheUnshackled. So thanks once again for your company, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for tuning in to The Unshackled Waves. Please visit theunshackledwaves.net for all the ways to subscribe and follow the show. Don't forget to pick up your free ebook at theunshackledbattlefield.net, and keep checking out theunshackled.net for all the latest news and commentary.